The man who measured my grass with a ruler, the HOA president, was stealing my electricity, and he smiled at me like I was the one being unreasonable. Yeah, that happened, and no, I didn't call the cops right away. I decided to have a little fun first and then finish the job properly. I work from home doing data analysis, which means I stare at patterns for a living. Numbers whisper things if you listen, and they were whispering that something was wrong with our meter. My wife and I live in one of those neighborhoods where every lawn looks like it was trimmed by a committee, and bylaws are recited at barbecues like scripture, but we liked it, mostly. Until the man at the end of the cul-de-sac started acting like he'd personally built the place, ruler in hand, pontificating about community standards while his yard did whatever he pleased. At first it was the small stuff, a passive-aggressive note here, a measuring tape unrolled at a neighbor's front step there, the classic performance of moral superiority. Then my smart meter pinged me at 2 a.m. with a spike. 30-45 kilowatt hours a day when our house normally sits around 15. The spikes were not random, they were a midnight to dawn thing, like someone flipped on a factory whenever the neighborhood went quiet. As a data person, I can tell you patterns like that don't happen by accident. I tried the normal things. I checked appliances, I double-checked schedules, I even unplugged a few curiosities. One night I flipped the master breaker, everything in the house dark, the fridge and lights and our carefully curated playlist dead, and watched the remote meter readings. Power was still being drawn 3,000 watts off our line while our house sat obediently in the dark. That's no ghost. That's a thief with a very expensive hobby. I could have gone straight to the utility company, but I wanted proof. Not just the numbers, but the evidence that would make it impossible to wiggle out of. So I played detective. I followed the conduit lines along the fence, pushed through the dense community hedges that everyone pretends they don't know about, and found a 240-volt outlet on the side of my house hacked, no professionally spliced into a heavy-duty weatherproof cable disappearing under the fence to his property. Whoever did that knew what they were doing. That pissed me off in a neat, efficient way. I knocked on his door like a neighbor, casual, polite, and he smiled. Then he blamed old wiring and suggested I was running my AC too hard. He even lectured me about leaving trash cans out an hour too late. The arrogance was a symptom. The disease was the splice in the greenhouse I later found tucked behind his garage like a secret at the edge of suburbia. Instead of unplugging the cord and calling it a day, I installed a little piece of tech that let me control how much power could flow through that outdoor outlet. A variable power controller, which is perfectly legal when used for dimming and fan control, and absolutely glorious when used creatively. I didn't cut the power off. I made his pumps and heaters struggle random throttles at odd hours so the equipment would groan and whine and his expensive setup would sound sick. That's when the nocturnal yard pacing began, a man in his bathrobe flashlight slicing the dark, muttering at a waterfall that had suddenly developed opinions. But courtroom proof requires witnesses and timestamps, so I glued a trail camera onto a fake birdhouse and pointed it at the fence. 2 nights later at 2 a.m., the motion sensor pinged my phone. There he was, sleeves rolled up, jiggling the cord, murmuring about faulty wiring like he was the victim of his own crime. That footage was the smoking gun, deliberate, repeated, and undeniable. I dug through our utility bills back 3 years, the entire tenure of his residency, and made a spreadsheet. Before he moved in, we averaged about 450 kilowatt hours a month. After our bills shot to roughly 1,350 kilowatt hours. Do the math, and the stolen power added up to thousands of dollars. And that's ignoring the wear and tear on our panel and the cruel bump into higher rate tiers. I took the spreadsheet, the footage, and a professional electrician's report to a friend who does code enforcement, not to play vigilante, but to build an undeniable case. When the electrician came back to inspect, I arranged to have him show up with his truck company logo visible, and I asked my friend to come as a witness. We knocked. The man answered, pale and surprised, and then tried the oldest trick in the book. Blame the previous owner, claim ignorance, promise to unplug. He was smooth until I played the 2 a.m. clip on my phone and then laid the spreadsheet on his porch like a grave marker. He went from confident bully to a man who suddenly smelled his own fear. I wanted consequences. Not just a check to replace the kilowatt hours, not just the embarrassment of being called out at a HOA meeting. This was theft. And in our state, theft of services over a certain amount can be a felony. So I laid down terms, resign from the board, pay triple the estimated damage to account for system wear and hassle, an amount large enough to hurt, small enough to be reasonable compared to legal fees and criminal exposure, or I file a police report that day. I wanted him to face something real for 3 years of taking from neighbors while lecturing them about moral fiber. A resignation and blasted it to the HOA, a resignation and blasted it to the HOA board right then. The electrician disconnected the splice and handed me the cord as evidence. I filed with the utility company. Within weeks, the neighborhood noticed the waterfall no longer sang 24/7, and the greenhouse that had hummed like a tropical shipyard quietly cooled off. The twist. It wasn't just his greed for exotic orchids and koi, it was how he'd been funding them. The new HOA president called me a month later embarrassed because an audit of HOA finances showed $15,000 missing from a landscaping fund approved by a man who'd been signing his own reimbursements. He had been buying plants for his greenhouse with communal dues. The stolen electricity was the tip of the iceberg underneath. It was embezzlement and habitually treating the neighborhood like his personal Amazon Prime cart. There were meetings. There were inquiries. The HOA filed complaints, and the man quietly settled with the board to avoid criminal charges. Between restitution repayments and legal fees, his little empire collapsed. He put his house up for sale within 6 months, 3 years in the neighborhood, and gone with his pond drained and his greenhouse dismantled. New owners filled the scar of his fountain with ordinary grass, and the ruling that no one measures grass with a ruler anymore felt like a tiny civic miracle. You want the moral. Here it is plain and not sanctimonious. Systems have patterns, and people who work inside them notice when they're being exploited. If you treat neighbors like subjects and hide your greed behind bylaws, you will eventually run into someone who reads spreadsheets for a living and has time to take notes. Justice isn't always dramatic or instantaneous. Sometimes it's a spreadsheet, a camera, and a little strategic throttling, but it can be unavoidable. And yes, would I do it again in a heartbeat? The investigation, the quiet sabotage, the camera, the confrontation, every step felt proportionate to the harm done and deliberate. Some will call it ruthless. Others will say, I took pleasure in the fall of a bully. Maybe both are true. But we were paying for someone else's greenhouse for 3 years while he lectured us about trash cans. That's not neighborly. That's theft. And I wanted the ledger to balance. Months later, sometimes I walk past that house and I still remember the exact moment I hit play on the footage and saw the color vanish from his face. There's a kind of silence now where the waterfall used to be a good, ordinary silence and our power bills are back to normal. I upgraded the panel, installed surge protection, and truth be told, I left the birdhouse camera as an insurance policy. Data is useful. Patterns tell stories. Sometimes those stories end with the bad guy paying the tab. So tell me, what would you do if you discovered a neighbor was bleeding you dry while lecturing you about morality? Would you call the cops first, or would you set a little trap of your own? Drop your take below, or tell your story if you've ever caught someone stealing from you. I want to know how you handled it.